I've always found the horror genre to be really intriguing. Just like romance is designed to appeal to feelings of love and comedy is supposed to conjure joy and laughter, horror and thriller media are made to leave you scared. And it's undeniable that a lot of horror stories are able to achieve this to a certain extent. There's quite a few movies and TV shows that have left me feeling genuinely afraid and anxious. But even still, I'd be hard-pressed to call a lot of horror media good. Sure, some of them are effective in small bursts, but comparing the average scores for horror content versus other mainstream genres, you start to get a glimpse of the larger picture. It seems like a lot of horror media just aren't very good, and in my opinion, this isn't due to a lack of effort when it comes to horror stories. In fact, this phenomena seems to be mostly caused by one of the most central practices of the horror genre as a whole: the utilization of the fear of the unknown. In order to explore this foundational pillar of horror stories, we're going to take a look at three distinct series. The first is The Three-Body Problem, both the book and the subsequent Netflix adaptation. While it's more of a sci-fi than a straight-up horror piece, it does have a lot of scary thriller elements which I think are worth exploring. And the second is a small webtoon called Control that strangely shares a lot of the same pitfalls as The Three-Body Problem. Lastly, we're going to examine an actually good execution of the horror genre in my opinion, by taking a look at another webtoon, Kim Carnaby's Pigpen. If it wasn't already obvious from this video being about horror as a genre, there may be some disturbing imagery and discussion of uncomfortable topics. Also, I'll be talking in detail about the endings of some of these series, so if you care about spoilers, you have been warned. So before we take a look at the first pieces of media, let's first talk about what makes something scary. In these examples, this will primarily be in regards to horror media specifically, but it also applies for the genres of thriller, mystery, and psychological. At least in my interpretation, there are two main avenues that you can take advantage of when constructing a story that's supposed to be scary. The first method is what I would like to call the phobia approach, and the second is the use of abstract or unknown horror. As you can tell from the title, this video is mainly about the second approach, but the first is still important to talk about. One of the most interesting things about humans is that we all have different things that scare us, and different degrees of fear towards these things. In some cases, these can take the form of a mild aversion, and in more extreme cases can manifest as full-on phobias, fears so strong that they can be debilitating. For example, I have a dislike of heights, but I don't have nearly as strong of a reaction to it as some other people may. But on the other hand, I have a pretty strong case of arachnophobia, which makes me very irrationally uncomfortable around spiders. So if you were tasked with making a movie that would scare me, it would probably be pretty easy. You could just make a movie full of spiders and have me freaking out from beginning to end. This is a clear example of the concrete method, otherwise known as the phobia approach. You're making use of the clearly defined fears that are unique to me in order to make me feel fear. This method is really intuitive, and if you think about it, it's all over most conventional horror stories. Scenes of insects, blood, or violence, these are all things that people have a direct and tangible aversion to, and so depicting them in your movie is a surefire way to scare people. The issue with this method comes when you start trying to scale it. If you are instead trying to make a movie for a whole theater full of people whose individual phobias are unknown, you kinda have no real place to start. You could single out one person and make the movie as scary as possible for them, but it's completely possible that nobody else in the theater will share those same fears. And so your movie is only good at scaring that one person you've designed it for. Now that isn't to say that this method fully fails when applying it to a large group of people. As I said earlier, one of the most frequent ways this is used is by targeting some of the most common fears that people have. The fear of dying, the fear of injury, sometimes dipping your toes into more novel ones like the fear of sharp objects or growing old. These are all things that horror movies like to draw on constantly as set dressing. Slasher films, for example, make do almost entirely with this approach, targeting the very real and common fear of serial killers and death that exists within a lot of people. The issue with this approach is that it's very inelegant. It's the equivalent of setting a trap out in the forest and just hoping that an animal will step in it. For the people that have a diminished fear of the phobias targeted by your movie, there seems to be nothing you can do. That is, until we consider the second method. Another very interesting thing about humans is that we're very good at filling in information. If you give somebody a pattern or repeating series of events with a hole in it, there's a solid chance that they'll be able to fill in that blank with something logical. For instance, if I read you the sentence fragment, "Hey, how's it?" you probably filled in that last word in your head. But the even more interesting thing is that each person will fill in that sentence differently, based on their personal experiences and ways of talking. This is the exact phenomena that a lot of horror and thriller content use to cast a much wider net than the phobia approach. And this is the utilization of the unknown. By choosing to purposefully hide elements of your story, you can force the audience into filling in those details for you. And as long as you properly set the mood and tone of the series, people will likely fill in those gaps in a way that's scarier than what may actually be there. That's why so many horror monsters are obscured, hidden in shadows and only shown in bits and pieces. This creates a phenomena where each audience member imagines the monster in a way that's personally scary to them, allowing movies to target a far wider audience than if they just used the phobia approach. Now, of course, the obvious issue with this method is that you can't keep the horror elements a mystery for the entire film. Let's just use some random horror monster as an example. If there's no real concrete answer as to what the monster is, audiences will be left feeling confused and disappointed since they never actually got to see the thing they imagined as being so terrifying. However, revealing the monster comes with its own set of challenges, as it means the illusion you've been weaving gets torn down. Suddenly, audiences get to compare the actual monster with the image they've been building in their head. And more often than not, the real monster that you've depicted in your movie isn't going to live up to the personal fears and imagination of each individual person. The moment you've brought your creation into the light, it turns back into a tangible and concrete monster that can only be scary to the people that find its design off-putting. But to everyone else who imagined a creature that was scary to them, they'll be left feeling cheated. In my opinion, this is the ultimate dilemma that exists for horror, mystery, and thriller media. When do you decide to show your hand and actually define the hidden elements of your series? If you fold too early, you may lose out on a lot of the benefits of keeping things in the dark. But the more you delay it, the higher the chance that people will build up an expectation that surpasses the thing you've actually built. In order to provide some concrete examples as to what I'm talking about, let's start by examining the three-body problem. The Three-Body Problem is a Chinese science fiction novel originally written by Liu Zhijian and eventually adapted into an 8-episode TV show. I'm personally more familiar with the book than the show, but the elements that I want to talk about are ubiquitous despite the differences in the adaptation. So to address the obvious caveat here, The Three-Body Problem is a sci-fi novel, very different from a horror or even thriller one. However, there are several large elements in The Three-Body Problem that drift into horror, for me at least, and the way that they are handled is something that I think is very relevant to this video. While the focus of The Three-Body Problem is of course the science fiction elements, that wasn't entirely what hooked me on the book at first. The entire impetus for the story of The Three-Body Problem is a string of deaths of high-profile scientists around the world. People with no relation to each other outside of their occupation are all found having taken their own life, one after the other, and many of them talk about their decision in cryptic ways, citing only that science is dead. And it seems like in some ways they're right, as simultaneously, particle accelerators around the world start to produce incomprehensible results that contradict the entire foundation of physics. At the same time, our main character starts to see a mysterious timer appear before their eyes, at first in the photos taken by his camera, and later in his own direct field of view. This phantom timer that no one else is able to see ticks down until some unknown future date, with no promise of what will happen when that time comes. Heeding the warning of one of his associates, the main character is given a time and date and told to look up at the sky, at which point he observes the entire sky flashing in and out of existence, flickering as if somebody was turning the stars off and on again. This entire hook was so unbelievably effective to me. It had my mind racing through possible explanations for all of these off-putting and seemingly unrelated phenomena. These elements of the story drift outside of the confines of sci-fi, and start to have the same pull as a good thriller or horror. They pull you in by revealing just enough of the mystery to keep you interested, while also making sure that its concepts are shocking enough to elicit some fear. In the exact same way that a horror story would, these elements quickly build into an overarching feeling of unease that persists throughout the entire story. I quickly ran through ideas of cosmic horror or maybe a psychological breakdown on the part of the main character, but I didn't have enough information to actually figure out what was going on, and that kept me listening intently, hooked on every word in this book, trying to figure out what horrible truth was hidden within. But unfortunately, the answer to that question came in a form that I was deeply unprepared for, and that kind of ruined my overall enjoyment of the series after the first book concluded. Essentially, the answer to all of these mysteries I laid out are the same. Aliens. It's revealed near the end of the first novel that the nameless primary antagonist of the series is a group of aliens known as the Trisolarans, due to the fact that their homeworld is stuck in the orbit of 3 suns. These Trisolarans used some sci-fi magic to inscribe code into a single particle, allowing for it to cause all the mayhem that we see in this novel. These so-called sophons are responsible for interfering with the particle accelerators, causing many physicists to believe that physics is broken and eventually leading to them taking their own lives. These sophons also used some method to display the countdown in the eyes of our main character, in an attempt to drive him insane and prevent his research into nanofibers. Finally, it is also these sophons that were responsible for causing the sky to blink in and out of existence, in a further attempt to disturb the main character's psyche. Now, all of this makes sense within the rules of the series, and it's a very interesting sci-fi concept to explore. The issue then goes back to that idea that I laid out before. The story let these mysteries sit for far too long, and the actual explanation behind them didn't live up to the image I had of the series in my head. The main disappointment here was at the actual limitation of the Sophons and these aliens in general. Compared to how powerful they seem to be in their assault on the science of Earth, it actually turns out that the Sophons aren't capable of doing any inherent damage. Their only use is in disrupting particle accelerators, interfering with the visual spectrum, and allowing for remote surveillance. Compared to the idea of a galactic horror like the one that was implied to me by all of those details, the actual reality of the Sophons and the Trisolarans in general fell far short of the reveal that I was expecting. Once the main character is able to find a group of Trisolaran sympathizers on Earth, pretty much the only direct threat to society is dissolved, since their entire hideout is uprooted and dismantled by government forces. In reality, this group of alien co-conspirators is actually just a bunch of dissatisfied rich people and human-hating intellectuals. And as soon as you realize that this unknown horror that's causing so much chaos and strife on Earth is actually just a bunch of couch-surfing aliens, it takes a lot of the spice out of the story. I was really hooked on the first half of this book, like I could not for the life of me peel myself away from it. But every moment after the reveal fell so flat. I almost had to force myself to make it through the sequel. Despite not actually being a horror story, this is the exact phenomena that I described earlier. In trying to make the antagonists of this book feel scary and threatening, the author utilized our fear of the unknown. While the individual events of the story prey on certain phobias, such as the fear of surveillance and death, the looming cause behind those events is left entirely to our imagination. And this lets our minds wander to different intriguing and horrifying answers to the questions this book lays out for us. But to me at least, the final answer this novel provides doesn't manage to live up to the expectations that I set for myself, and that made the final story fall short of what it could have been. Before we talk about the second example that I mentioned earlier, I want to take a very brief detour. So you may have noticed from the way I talked about the three-body problem that a lot of the things I spoke about can be called really subjective. And that's because, yeah, maybe the book didn't stick the landing for me, but it's very possible that somebody else was completely satisfied by the Trisolaran reveal. And that's something that comes down to the very nature of this practice. As I mentioned earlier, each and every person who comes across one of these mysteries will naturally fill in the details in a way that's unique to them. And that could mean that somebody out there was pleasantly surprised by the reveal in the three-body problem. Heck, there's probably somebody out there who exactly guessed the plot and had a perfectly neutral reaction to this novel. And with that level of subjectivity, it can be hard to properly assign blame. Even though I was disappointed by some of the choices this book made, you can always make the argument that this is my fault for having those expectations in the first place. However, it's my opinion that this is something that the author should consider and learn to manage. It's part of the art of writing mysteries to properly corral people's expectations in a way that ultimately results in the least amount of people being disappointed. And there are a number of strategies that can allow authors and writers to capitalize on the fear of the unknown, while also preventing people's expectations from straying too far from the actual truth. And I'll be talking about a couple of these strategies once we get to the third and final example of this video. But for now, just keep in mind that everyone's gut reaction to some of these stories will be different. And even if your expectations of the series were different than mine, I hope you'll try to understand where I'm coming from. Anyways, on to the second example. So Control, or Domination as it's also called, is a very small and relatively unknown webtoon by the author of Burning Effect, one of my personal favorite action series. It may seem like a weird pick to talk about in this video, but there are a couple things that make this webtoon a perfect example of the fear of the unknown. The biggest thing that makes Control noteworthy is how absolutely effective the first few chapters are. The webtoon starts out with this terrifying scene of the main character feeling like he's being watched, with the sight of whatever's outside of his window seemingly driving his mom insane. And upon trying to tell his girlfriend about the experience he had, she gets run over by a truck and all of the evidence she existed is erased from his life. Upon returning home, he begins playing this insane game of cat and mouse with his mom, while trying to keep her safe and figure out what the heck is going on. The opening of this webtoon is genuinely one of the most chilling things I've ever read, and the primary reason has to do with how Control makes use of the fear of the unknown. While the story does make use of a couple big existential fears, such as the fear of having your loved ones disappear or of them going insane and wanting to harm you, the most effective part of this webtoon is the overall sense of unease. You don't know what's causing all of this to happen. You have sincerely no idea where the plot could go from here. The main character could be trapped in the scheme of some malicious, all-powerful entity, or he could simply be going insane. And the way the webtoon dangles these answers just out of reach while dragging you through forests of unnerving imagery is just perfectly done. It is almost engineered in a way that will freak you out and have you keeping the lights on while you sleep. But in creating such an incredible sense of fear, Control also sets a massive trap for itself to have to deal with. Since so much of the terror of this webtoon comes down to ideas that are unknown and unexplained at the start, there's a massive amount of expectations around what the answers actually are. Just like with the three-body problem, the story's competence in setting up a mystery holds it to a really high standard once those mysteries actually get paid off. And just like in the last example, unfortunately Control isn't able to measure up. Interestingly enough, the answer to most of the mysteries in Control is the same as the one in the three-body problem: aliens. Or time travel aliens, or in some cases, time travel and aliens. See, the first mysterious figure that appears to be observing the main character in Control is actually another version of himself from the not-so-distant future. And the second is actually the leader of a group of aliens that are trying to take possession of Earth. But those aliens are actually evolved humans from a future version of Earth who have traveled back to the past in order to find a safe place to live. So yeah, it can get a little bit confusing. Regardless of the myriad of answers that Control gives to its mysteries, none of them end up feeling very satisfying. And this isn't a problem for so much of the webtoon. Even as some of the answers start coming out, Control still manages to retain a very high level of quality. There's this hypnotist lady that gets introduced who's able to use her powers to interrogate the various aliens that are disguised as humans. And using this technique, the main characters are able to uncover a number of things about the world around them, such as the fact that these monsters want to steal the body of humans, and that the main character is for some reason referred to as the king of these aliens. Control actually does a great job at pacing the information that it provides, which is one of the key aspects to making a mystery like this. Every time the suspense starts to run dry and you become more at ease with the story, some new plot point or fact is brought to light which drags you in a completely different, more disturbing direction. It's really impressive to drip feed this information to the audience in a way that keeps them on the hook. Over time, as you read this webtoon, the sense of anticipation and mystery only grows. But then comes the moment where everything is revealed, and the true story of Control is brought to light. And unfortunately, the answer is just a little too much to be considered satisfying. Suddenly, from this fairly claustrophobic and suffocating story about a few humans desperate to survive, we get catapulted into a sci-fi narrative with time travel and body horror and action, and for me at least, it kinda kills the earlier tone. As soon as the main characters beat the alien leader on Earth, they get teleported into the spaceship called the Ark, which is apparently in the process of making a copy of the Earth, which results in a time delay during which there are two versions of the main character running around at the exact same time. And so we learn that a lot of the mysteries happening at the start of the webtoon are actually a result of the main characters from the future doing a variety of different shenanigans. Putting aside the number of possible plot inconsistencies and objections I have to this premise, this section of the webtoon just doesn't work in my opinion. The entire appeal of Control was this oppressive feeling of fear, believing that the world is against you and starting to understand that you might just be right. This one panel of some unknown entity staring through the main character's window is so unnerving just by itself. But learning that this figure is just the main character from the future who accidentally made contact with his past self takes away that sense of fear. Even when it turns out that the leader of the aliens is also observing the main character, we don't really care as much, because the main characters are able to fight and beat the alien leader without too much trouble. And that's the biggest issue I have with this reveal. As soon as you show us that these terrifying and off-putting figures are actually pretty stupid and easy to defeat, they lose almost all of their power. They no longer have the frightening air of being unknowable, and they also pose seemingly very little threat in their tangible form. Because of this failure, Control ends up feeling gutted. All that you're left with is this trio of fairly unlikable main characters flailing around and making a mess of things. Similarly to the three-body problem, the story fails to maintain or make use of the mystery it sets up throughout its run, and I really don't like the direction the story went after this reveal took place. After the main characters have made a mess of this past version of the Earth, the leader of the aliens strikes a deal with them and shows them the true version of the Ark, which is a spaceship full of grotesque human experiments and really disturbing aliens. Essentially, the entire third act of this webtoon devolves into a shock factor story, where the only thing keeping you around is the morbid curiosity of seeing the next gross and gory scene. And I'm just not a fan of those types of stories. The first half of Control is so good because it puts so much effort into maintaining this fear of the unknown, the terror of this pitch-black figure standing outside of your window. And over time, as this fear fragments and falls apart, the story tries to replace it with tangible fears, grotesque scenes that prey on phobias and shock value in order to inspire emotion. And it just becomes so cheap after a certain point. I don't think anything will ever capture the abject fear of the first 2 chapters of this webtoon. It truly struck the perfect balance, and I was so ready to go along for the ride and see what truth lay at the core of all of that fear. But unfortunately, the truth was more disappointing than if there wasn't an answer in the first place. The fear of the unknown made the opening of this webtoon my favorite horror series of all time, but somehow the lack of payoff to this fear takes away all of that power and intrigue. Having looked at these 2 examples, I'm sure a lot of you are thinking the same thing. The fear of the unknown seems like a lot more trouble than it's worth. And to be fair, you may kinda be right. This technique is extremely volatile. It can create some of the most chilling and effective horror moments of all time. But if handled incorrectly, these moments can so easily be spoiled in retrospect. Well, there are a number of stories that have successfully used the fear of the unknown without falling into some of the pitfalls that it creates. And we're going to talk about some strategies for how to do that by examining one of my favorite thriller webtoons of all time. Kim Carnaby is a very prolific webtoon writer, with his series Sweet Home even getting its own Netflix adaptation. But my favorite work of his by far is Pigpen. Pigpen is a psychological thriller about a man who gets shipwrecked on a remote island and has to deal with a strange family that runs a bed and breakfast there. And in my opinion, this webtoon provides the perfect example of how to make use of the fear of the unknown. The first exceptional thing about this webtoon is the pace at which the mysteries of its story are resolved. There are 2 big overarching unknowns at the start of Pigpen. The first has to do with the true identity of the main character, and the second is in regards to the family that lives on the island and what their deal is. To start out with, the main character has full-on amnesia and can't remember anything about his past. And while the family takes him in and feeds him, they start acting pretty dang strange, preventing him from figuring out where he is and blocking off any means of escape from the island. There's this constant escalation of the stakes as the main character finds more and more information that points to the family being up to no good. Rami, the eldest daughter of the family, strongly implies that she's being abused, and tries to convince the main character to escape the island with her. He also learns that Minu, the eldest son of the family, hit him over the head with a shovel, causing his initial blackout in front of the bed and breakfast. Finally, he hears about a pair of tourists that are visiting the island, who the protagonist is mysteriously kept away from. Due to his fear of the family, the main character ends up stealing a knife and attempting to explore the island at night, trying to figure out anything about where he is. But upon confronting the family about this, a lot of the information we learn gets turned on its head. Rami was actually lying to the main character about being mistreated and was just using him to go on a shopping trip. The family's animosity towards him was only because he stole a knife and was suspiciously sneaking around their house. And the customers that he saw arriving at the bed and breakfast were actually nowhere to be seen. Throughout this entire scene, we have no idea who to trust. We as the audience have seen all the things that the main character saw, and we know how suspicious this family is. But it seems so possible that the protagonist could just be insane and seeing things. And this cultivates such a palpable tension throughout the webtoon. The feeling of doubt and uncertainty that comes from these narratives creates such an uneasy atmosphere. The fear of the unknown, the confusion as to what is real and who is actually dangerous, it's such a chilling central storyline to explore throughout this webtoon. This mystery gets slowly unraveled over the course of the story, with each piece of new information being perfectly placed to keep you as the audience engaged. After the confrontation with the family, you feel convinced that the main character is actually crazy. But then he finds the ripped and bloodied clothes of the tourists who he saw on the island, which seems to prove that they were actually there. But then, after Rami gives him a bottle of rat poison, the main character jumps to the conclusion that Rami wants him to poison her family, which once again makes us doubt the main character's sanity. And this happens over and over again, constantly making us flip back and forth between sympathizing with the main character and fearing him. Eventually, we get the mid-story twist that the protagonist is actually a prolific serial killer, seemingly supporting the family's fear of him. The pacing of the information in this webtoon is something that I think is vital to properly capitalizing on the fear of the unknown. Even if you have the scariest premise and most enticing hook, if you can't keep the audience on the line, then they'll either start to imagine things about your story that aren't actually there, or they'll get disinterested and disconnected from the story you're trying to tell. And this is exactly what happens in The Three-Body Problem and Control, respectively. The Three-Body Problem doesn't provide enough information and setup for the audience to pick up on where the story is going, which led me to be disappointed by the time the answers were revealed. And Control flipped things a little too quickly with its time travel narrative, which stopped me from being able to connect to the horror of the story. In contrast to the mistakes of these two series, Pigpen provides a steady stream of new and relevant information that constantly guides your expectations towards the true ending of the story. The unknowns about the family and island and the main character himself are slowly but surely picked apart, while still keeping you engaged for the entire process. And this means that when the answers come to light, when the unknown becomes the known, it feels correct. There's no confusion or disappointment. It's like a puzzle piece is fit into place. So that's why the pacing of information is important to properly utilize the fear of the unknown. But there's one more big thing that can make or break a story, and that has to do with how an author chooses to fill in the hole left by the unknown elements of a story. Building up a narrative is a lot like building a tower of Jenga blocks. Each character and plot point and scene all stack on top of each other and eventually make a story in its entirety. And in this analogy, using the fear of the unknown is like adding a massive block of foundation to the base of your tower. It grounds your story and provides a really interesting hook, while also enticing the audience to stick around and see where the story ends up. But the issue is that this foundation is inherently temporary. Even if you are Pigpen and you're able to drag the mystery out without losing the audience, there needs to be an answer. If something remains unknown forever, it isn't scary anymore, it's just frustrating. And so the biggest challenge when dealing with this part of storytelling is figuring out how to minimize the damage caused by removing this foundational block of your story. If you remove the fear of the unknown without care and consideration, it can cause the rest of your story to crumble. This is basically what happened in Control. The story was built up so fast and so strong with this deeply relatable and unknown fear at the base of it. But as soon as that block was removed, as soon as we got an answer to that mystery, the rest of the story kind of fell apart. With how fast and clumsily that unknown was taken away, there was nothing supporting the characters or action or world. The story just became a bit dull. And to its credit, Control quickly tries to fill that gap in. It used a combination of body horror and shock factor and all of these other things to try and recapture the audience's attention, to instill the same amount of fear and unease that the unknown once did. But in the end, it wasn't enough to save the story. Similarly, with the three-body problem, the book also uses the fear of the unknown to quickly bring us into its world. With the cosmic mysteries at its base, it feels like a full and thrilling story. But then that underlying mystery is taken away. And unlike in Control, where there isn't anything able to fill the gap left in the story, the three-body problem does actually have other things that can serve as the new foundation. The novel takes this opportunity to delve into its science fiction elements, exploring the Trisolaran society and its many exploits. The issue then is that with this new foundation, the story changes on a dime. While it still relied on the fear of the unknown, the three-body problem had the atmosphere of a cosmic thriller or horror. But as soon as the switch takes place, it becomes just a normal sci-fi story, albeit with some very interesting ideas. And while the story doesn't fall apart in the same way that Control does, its switch in genres and construction make it hard to swallow because of my love for what it once was. I became so attached to the story's previous angle that anything else just feels less. And that's where Pigpen, once again, provides an example of how to do things right. At first, the primary hook of the story has to do with the unknown circumstances that surround our main character. What is this family's deal? Where is the protagonist stranded? Why are all of his memories gone? And with these unknowns comes the fear and unease that mires the first half of the story. You feel genuinely unnerved for so much of the opening due to how mysterious some of these plot points are. But slowly over the course of the story, the mysteries get more condensed and focused, and they start to center more and more around the main character. Over time, without you even realizing it, all the important questions have to do with the protagonist's past and the memories that he seems to be repressing. And finally, we get the reveal that this entire world is actually an illusion that has been constructed in the main character's mind, save for the main character's adoptive father, who's secretly infiltrating the protagonist's mind in order to find out about his past. Now, this may sound like a disappointing reveal, in the same way that it's almost never satisfying to conclude a story by saying it was all a dream. But Pigpen is actually engineered in a way for this answer to hit as hard as it can. We finally get an answer to basically all of the main mysteries of the webtoon. And along with the truth of this world, we also learn about the protagonist's backstory, which is a truly tragic tale. The emotions and sadness you feel on behalf of pretty much everyone involved is so real and palpable. But with all the mysteries of this webtoon solved, it seems like the story should lose its pull. In the same way that Control and the three-body problem fell apart once the reveals happened, it should make sense for Pigpen to also fall into the same trap. Except it doesn't. Pigpen finishes strong, and in fact has one of my personal favorite endings in all of webtoon. And there's one main reason why. See, as I said earlier, throughout its latter half, Pigpen slowly shifts the crux of its story from the mystery of its world over to the emotional journey of the main character. Without you even realizing it, the story's foundation shifts from the initial fear of the unknown to the two people that actually exist at the core of the story. And so when this big reveal happens and you finally get to see their past and the tragedy that binds them together, it's exactly what you want it to be. Pigpen guides your expectations as the reader into caring so much about the protagonist and his past, which makes the story's shift so unproblematic, since the new information fits into place like the centerpiece of a massive puzzle. Unlike in Control, this twist is reasonable and well executed, which prevents the story from falling apart once the fear of the unknown is lost. And in contrast to the three-body problem, the new story is exactly what you want it to be, which prevents any feelings of disappointment or betrayal over this new direction. I like to imagine it as having to pull out one of the bottom blocks when playing Jenga. If you make a mistake when resolving the mysteries of your story, you risk losing one of the central pillars that held it together. And if the block you replace it with is the wrong size or shape, the tower that results can be unsteady or off balance, which can set you up for failure in the long run. Pigpen is a unique story in that it perfectly pulls off this maneuver, slowly but surely replacing the foundational fear of the unknown with a deeply emotional tragedy, and one that's sculpted in a way that allows it to perfectly fill the gap of the mystery. The fear of the unknown is an effective technique that's everywhere in horror and thriller media. It's pretty much the only effective way to build tension and fear on a larger scale. But so many writers seem to miss the pitfalls that can come with using this technique. So many stories are out there with amazing mystery hooks and ideas that just end up botched due to the lack of care and consideration for the moment of a reveal. And that's why I wanted to make this video, to highlight how vital it is to pay attention to audience expectations and the way you pay off certain mysteries. And I think if you do that, you're well on your way to writing an exceptional horror or thriller story. Thank you guys so much for watching. This is a very long video that will undoubtedly take a while to edit, so thank you for your patience in sticking around for this entire thing. This is pretty different from the usual stuff I make, but I was itching to do something really in-depth and out there, and this ended up being the result. I hope the final product was still entertaining and that I did this topic justice. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing and sharing this to anyone you think may be interested. YouTube has been really mean recently. Anyways, thank you for sticking around. I hope you enjoyed.